Hi, everyone. So there's a book by Jared Diamond called The Third Chimpanzee, and I was thinking about that this morning because, humans are the third chimpanzee. There's the normal chimpanzees, there's the bonobos, and then there's us in between. But today, what we're going to be talking about is fourth species. And I was thinking about what would the fourth species of chimpanzee be, and I realized it would be the future. So if you want, you can think of this lecture on fourth species counterpoint as being the music of the future. Now, it's actually probably not really how you should think about it, because even when species counterpoint was created, it was already a throwback. So, there's a couple of different evolutions of people developing species counterpoint as teaching tools, but the most famous one, the one we use and everybody uses, is by Fuchs in 1725. And at that point, he's writing a counterpoint treatise based on the music of Palestrina, who is from the Renaissance, from late 1500s. So a long time ago at that point, and already at this point, nobody is writing in the strict Palestrinian style. They're writing in the classical style, early classical style. So a throwback when he wrote it. I was looking for examples in the literature that use, strict fourth species counterpoint, and it's just very hard to find. So not exactly the music of the future, but I wonder what you'll be able to do with it. Let's just see. So we are talking today about fourth species counterpoint with me, your host, Dr. David Bashwiner from the University of New Mexico. Let's review what the 5 different species of counterpoint are, with a little help from our friend, the Count. Thank you, the Count. First species counterpoint is 1 against 1, which means 1 note in the counterpoint for each note that's given in the cantus firmus. Second species counterpoint is 2 notes against 1. 2 notes in the counterpoint against each 1 given note in the cantus firmus. Third species, you would think would be 3 against 1. Sometimes it is, but mostly it's 4 against 1. Sometimes it's 8 against 1 or 12 against 1, but that's in other... Anyway, in the stuff that we're doing, straightforward species counterpoint, Fuchs-based 4 against 1. And now today we're going to be talking about fourth species, which involves suspensions. And it goes back to the 2 against 1 sort of framework. We have suspensions in the contrapuntal voice that are against the given notes in the cantus firmus. And it sort of looks like second species, but with a bunch of ties. And those ties are tying over suspensions. And then today we're not getting to fifth species, but I will just tell you what it is. Oh, sorry. Thank you. That was our picture of the Count doing fourth species. So fifth species, we would really like to see that. Fifth species is rhythmic, and it has rhythmic variety. It's hard to see that. And let's see if we can move the Count. Not very helpful. Okay, yeah. Oh, God. Okay, thank you. Fifth species, rhythmic variety, many to 1 counterpoint. So it's basically combines all the other species. It has rhythmic variety in the contrapuntal voice against whole notes in the cantus firmus. So that ends up being the closest to what real music is like. So let's take an example of fourth species counterpoint. This is me singing it with my friend Me. And then this, of course, comes from the book that you were looking at for today by Felix Saucer and Carl Schechter.
A, B, G sharp, C sharp, F sharp, E, C sharp, A, F sharp, D, D, C sharp, B, G sharp,
And we'll look at that example in a bit more detail in a moment, but for now I just wanted to show you what a fourth species counterpoint exercise looks like. You can see on the page it sort of looks like second species, but of course there's all those ties. So the point of fourth species counterpoint is really to introduce the suspension. The primary goal is for you to practice using suspensions. So in the next chapter in the Lates book, you're going to learn about all the non-chord tones that you haven't been working with yet, and the suspension is one of them. And the suspensions are just quite complex, and I've always experienced it as a problem to try to squeeze them into that one chapter with all the other non-chord tones that you haven't learned. So the reason we're doing fourth species right now is so that you can get practice using suspensions in a very simple context. So a suspension is a specific type of non-chord tone, otherwise known as an embellishing tone. It is a dissonance. So all non-chord tones are dissonances of some sort, and I have that marked D. You can see that in the figure below. The suspended note S always appears on a stronger beat than the consonants that it resolves to. And then so let's see the consonants. And then in the picture below, I have the S marked in red and the R marked in orange. And you can see I have SW written at the top of that figure, strong, weak, little bars there. Or in the middle line of the figure has a dashed line. So this might even be a bar of 4 beats per measure. So strong, weak, all within 1 bar. But in any event, the S appears on a stronger beat than the R. Even if it's not on the downbeat of the bar, it could appear on bar 3. In fourth species, what we're doing today, assume that this middle line here is an actual bar. So this would be the first half note, second half note, first half note, second half note. So for us, the S is appearing on the first half note, the downbeat of the bar. And it's resolving on the weak beat. So otherwise known as it's accented. There's different types of accent, right? One of them is you just make something louder. One of them, another type of accent, is it's metrically accented. And that's what we mean when we talk about accented non-chord tones. Okay, the suspended note is always a single step, could be a half step or a whole step, above the tone that it resolves to. So you can see S going down to R, and R is going to be just a scale step below. In other words, the suspended note always resolves down by step. And the suspended note is prepared by the little consonants before it in the previous bar by a consonant. So I have that tied over there. The consonants comes before the downbeat here. It's called the preparation. It's tied over. So the suspension here isn't, it's a dissonance, right? But it isn't just random. It has been prepared in the previous bar, and it resolves in a very particular way in the following bar.
A, G sharp.
That's just a reminder of what we heard at the very beginning of the last excerpt you saw. So it starts A, and B. Against the A is a 7th, and that's a dissonance, so that makes the S have to come down to G sharp, B, A, G sharp. Okay, and we'll look at that in future screens. Now, let's do a little bit more, just very detailed, like what is a suspension? Suspensions are always dissonant. So I have the S there, and it's above the D. D for dissonance. The suspended note is dissonant, but it is prepared by a consonance, right? And it's resolving to a consonance. So it's not just a random dissonant note. It's a very, very specific type of dissonance. Okay, suspensions are always accented. So you can see it's coming on a strong beat. The note that is dissonant is always on a strong beat relative to its resolution. Suspensions are always prepared. The note that is dissonant is always prepared tied over from a previous consonance. It can't be tied over from a dissonance. It has to be prepared as a consonance. You will, in the next chapter, you're going to learn about unprepared suspensions. So we don't call them those, and even unprepared retardation, but it's the exact same principle. So you're going to learn that term, appoggiatura. Appoggiatura, like another name for it, is going to be an accented incomplete neighbor. You don't need to know about this right now, but the reason I'm telling you is that a suspension has to have these 3 parts: preparation, suspension, resolution. If it doesn't have the preparation, then you could still find that in music, but it's not called a suspension. It's called something else. It's an appoggiatura. Okay, and then reminder that suspensions are always resolved, and they're always resolved downward by step, hence that. And if you had an upward resolving suspension, you don't call it a suspension. You call it something different. So it's like you can have this same pattern, a note that's a dissonance that's prepared by a consonance and that resolves upward, but it's just not called a suspension. It's called a retardation, and you learn about that in the next chapter as well. This is by Vicente Lusitano. So this is a very complex piece. It's a really beautiful piece from a long time ago, from the Renaissance, from exactly the same time Palestrina was writing. It's by Vicente Lusitano. It's called Heu. Well, actually, I don't know how to say it. Eu me domine. Vicente Lusitano was a Renaissance-era Portuguese composer and music theorist, and he was of African descent. And I believe he is the earliest music theorist and maybe earliest published composer who is known in the West of African descent. This piece is, I think this is maybe the best known of his pieces. He's known well in music theory circles because he had an argument with Vicentino. In any event, this piece it's so interesting. Maybe I'll find another way to send the whole thing to you so you can listen to it. But if you listen from the beginning, you'll see it's characterized by a rising chromatic line that keeps being harmonized in just very, very unusual ways. And here we have the end of the piece, and I chose this because there's 4 different suspensions in here. So suspensions were first found in the evolution of polyphony in the West. They're first found at cadences. And here what we have are basically a series of very tiny cadences, and they're not exactly standard. What we saw, like for instance, in the video, The Evolution of the Triad, what we saw is suspensions were almost always resolving down to the leading tone of the penultimate chord. Here they're resolving down to that same kind of tone, a leading tone type thing, but that tone isn't always resolving on the next chord because this is a more complex harmonic passage. But in any event, we'll see later how that works, the resolution of the leading tone into the penultimate chord. And then we are going to see here that the suspensions are always prepared, and they're still always resolving down by steps. So they're traditional suspensions. And then each instance here, as I'm going to show you, is sort of a tiny cadence, except of course for the bigger cadence at the end of the piece. And just want to point out that the suspensions are considered suspensions when measured against the bass. So just want to point out that this is a very complex work. I wouldn't expect you to look at this or listen to it and hear the suspensions yourself automatically. The reason we work with 4th species is because it's very highly simplified. But I wanted to show you how suspensions are found in a real piece of music. At a point that's fairly early in time, suspensions get used all over the place in Baroque and classical music. But in the Renaissance is kind of like you can see Renaissance music, there's like a kind of evolution toward using more and more suspensions. So let's look at each of these. In the first set, that's on the left, you have the E flat and the bass. Remember, we're always comparing against the bass. So here's my mouse. Anyway, E flat and the bass against G and the melody. So that's fine, but I have the 4 circled, the moment of suspension. There's a D in the bass and a G in the melody. So that's a dissonance. A 4th is a dissonance. So we can sort of ask, is that a suspension? Well, the G is a 4th, it's a dissonance. Does it resolve down by step? Yes, it resolves to a 3rd with the F sharp. And is it prepared by a consonance? Yes, the G that prepares it is a 3rd against the bass. So we can now look at this next moment, the D in the alto. The D in the alto that is marked S, that is again producing a 4th against the bass. D in the alto, A in the bass. So that's a dissonance that needs to be explained somewhere. It's prepared by the D in the bar before, and that D is a consonance. It's an octave above the D that's in the bass. It's still hanging on. And then it resolves down to the C sharp, so that's a 3rd. When we look later on, toward the end, we have in red, the D is still hanging on in the upper voice, right? That D is there, and it's a 4th against the A that's in the bass. The D has been prepared on the previous beat, as a consonant, and it is resolving down by step. So that's a suspension. And then this last one, the note that's marked in red, right? The G is in the bass. The soprano note that's still hanging on there is a C. That C has been prepared on the previous beat, and it's resolving down by step to a consonant, to a third. Okay. This is kind of small and hard to see. We're going to listen one more time, and then we'll look in more detail. Oops, I thought we were going to listen one more time. Let's try. So let's think about how to identify suspensions. If you were looking at this piece of music, how would you find them? We're going to hear just, this is the first 2 bars of what we were hearing before. We get to listen again. So there's 2 suspensions in there. So the first, you would identify the note that is dissonant, and that's because dissonants are things that need to be explained. If you have consonances, you don't have to explain them, they're just there because they're consonances. But if they're dissonances, they function in specific ways. So you find a note that is a dissonance, and that G there in the soprano is a dissonance against the bass. The G4, it measures 6 to 7. It's a 4th above the bass, and technically it's an 11th, but either way, it's a dissonance. So you can ask, could that be a suspension? First question asked might be, is it on a strong beat? Yeah, it's on the downbeat of the bar. You can see the bar line right behind it, so yes. Is it prepared by being tied over from the consonants? Yes, because that G that prepares it in the previous bar is a 3rd or 10th against the E flat in the bass. And then does it, okay, and then just a reminder, consonants are just like with all the species counterpoint, the unison, 3rd, 5th, 6th, and then the octave equivalents of those. So the 3rd is a 10th, the 5th becomes a 12th, whatever. Okay, and then does this note resolve down by step? Yes, it's resolving down by step to a consonant. It resolves down to F sharp, and when it does resolve down to F sharp, the D against the F sharp is a 3rd. So this is a suspension. Yay! Let's try. Okay. So it was a little hard to hear, but that was that whole passage again. Let's try this with the final notes in the alto, sorry. So is the note that's marked S there a dissonance on a strong beat? And so it's a dissonance, it's a D against the A in the bass, and it's on the downbeat again. So yes, it is a dissonance. Then we can say, could that kind of dissonance be a suspension? Is it prepared? Yes, the D is tied over from the previous bar, and that D that's tied over is an octave above the bass note. Notice that bass note, right, that's holding on for that whole bar. So the bass note is still going. So the D in the alto is an octave above the bass note. And then does it resolve correctly? Does the note marked S resolve down by step? Yes, it does. And when it resolves down by step to C sharp, that C sharp is a 3rd above the bass, or 10th. So it's a suspension. Here's our new suspension. That's the second suspension. Okay, so now we get to look at some less complex music and just focus on 4th species itself. The aim of 4th species is to practice using suspensions. Remember these basic principles of how suspensions are constructed. Suspensions are always dissonant. The dissonance always appears in the strong beat relative to the resolution. The dissonant note is always prepared as a consonance tied over from the previous bar. The dissonance always resolves downward by step to a consonance. And the main dissonance used in fourth species is the suspension, but the passing tone can also be used. So the passing tone is only found when you break the species, and we talk about that specifically on a later screen. But here's what the logic is. Although the goal of fourth species is to incorporate as many suspensions as possible, it's not always possible, or it's not possible to have a suspension in every single bar. So what do you do when you don't have a suspension? Bars that do not have a suspension are therefore going to be in second species, because you're working in half notes, right? And that's called breaking species. You should expect to break species at least once or twice per exercise. When you break species, follow the rules of second species, where the only dissonance allowed is the passing tone. And that passing tone is on the second half of the bar, and I just want to point out, therefore, that suspensions are dissonances, and passing tones are dissonances. Suspensions always occur on the strong beat of the bar, and passing tones have to occur on the weak beat of the bar. Other options that you could do in the second half of the bar, since we're reverting to second species, is to include a consonant leap or a consonant passing tone. So here are some tips for working suspensions into your fourth species exercises. At the end of the exercise, remember your canus firmus is pretty much always going to end 3, 2, 1, or mi, re, do if you're in major. And therefore, the counterpoint should always go, if the canus firmus is going 3, 2, 1, the counterpoint should go 1, 7, 1. And the 1 is going to be held over and resolved to the 7 as a suspension. I wish I had a visual example of that, but we're going to see that in every exercise that we look at from here on. So you will see an example in a second. At the beginning of the exercise, so basically you are going to have a suspension at the end of the exercise. You're suspending into the penultimate bar. At the beginning of the exercise, if the canus firmus is below, right, and the counterpoint is above, then you can try to put either scale degree 1 in the counterpoint or scale degree 5 as the contrapuntal note. And then that note is coming in the second half of bar 1. And then try tying it over and see if it works. So whatever happens in the canus firmus in the next bar, just try tying over whatever note you put in the first bar in the counterpoint and see if it works to create a suspension. If the canus firmus is above and your counterpoint is below, I just want to point out, you do have to begin on scale degree 1 in the counterpoint. It could be an octave below the canus firmus, it could be a unison with the canus firmus, but you can't begin on scale degree 5 in that case because you have to establish the tonic. But anyway, still try the thing, see what happens when you tie it over, and then see if it works in bar 2 as a suspension. You can tell that it works if it forms a dissonance against the bass note of the canus firmus, or dissonance against the other note of the canus firmus of bar 2, and then resolves downward into a consonance. And then at the middle of the exercise, as you've got the beginning, you've got the end, what do you do in the middle? One thing to do is look for passages in which the canus firmus descends by step. So suspensions are always, like the suspended note is always going to descend by step. And if your canus firmus is also descending by step, that means you can, for every note that descends you can basically set up a series of suspensions, a chain of suspensions that's going to follow that movement. And we will see an example of that. So far, you've got the beginning of the exercise, the end of the exercise. You've looked in the middle for passages where there would be 2 or 3 notes in a row in the canus firmus where it's descending by step. And then you're going to still have some places in between. And you could sketch in a climax like we've done with the previous species, and then just start filling stuff in and then adjust as needed. So let's look at an example. We heard this at the very beginning. We're going to hear it again, and then we're going to just analyze it in more detail, pretending that we are composing this ourselves.
A, B, G sharp, C sharp, F sharp, E, C sharp, A, F sharp, D, C sharp, B, G sharp,
So imagine this you composing it. The cantus firmus is the line given below. So the first thing you do is sing it to yourself a couple times. You usually sing it slowly at first and then quickly. And you do it on note names. Since it's in alto clef, we do it on note names. But A, B, C sharp, F sharp, E, A, B, D, C sharp, B, A. And then I might do that 2 or 3 times, then close my eyes and try to do it to make sure I can think of it. Da, 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 ba, da, da, da. Okay, then we're going to think about the beginning and the end of the exercise. So at the beginning, as we mentioned, just like in second species, you're going to have a half rest at the beginning, and then you're going to use the note that's either scale degree 1 or scale degree 5. So the case here, we have the bass is on A, and the cantus firmus is on A, so that's scale degree 1. And then I'm just going to point out that when the cantus firmus is above, and we're writing a counterpoint below, that's what we'll see on the next screen, the counterpoint has to begin on 1 and not 5, because you need to establish the mode, establish the tonic. Okay. At the ending, just like in second species, the second half of the penultimate bar has to have the leading tone. The second to last note there in the counterpoint is the G sharp, that's the leading tone. And then what's new here is that in the first half of the penultimate bar, you have a suspension that resolves into the leading tone. So you have scale degree 1 resolving down to 7 and then back to 1 in the second to last bar and the final bar. Okay, so step 3, because we've already looked at the B, we've sung the cantus firmus and we've looked at the beginning and the end of the exercise. Now, we're going to identify passages in the cantus firmus that descend by step. So the point here is that these can always be set as chains of suspensions of the same type. So we can see that in bars 4 to 5, and then the last 4 bars of the piece, we have descending motion in the cantus firmus by step. So we know that that can be set up as a chain of suspensions. So if a certain suspension is going to work in bar 4 above the F sharp, then we know that the same thing should be able to work in the next bar as well, bar 5. And then the same thing we might not want to have this many because of variety, but we know that the last 4 bars could probably have the same chain of suspensions, except for the very final bar. And then when the cantus firmus is above, I'm just pointing this out because this is what we're going to see in the next screen. 2, 3 is the best suspension to use. 5, 6 is also okay. The thing is the idea here is that the 7, 6 suspension, that's something only when the suspended voice is above the bass. But above the cantus firmus. If the cantus firmus is above, then a 7, 6 is not a 7, 6. It's basically a 2, 3. And I think that will become a little bit more clear as we go on. Okay, so then once you've done all of the above things, you don't have that much left. You sketch in a climax. Here we can see there's basically a climax in bar 3, the end of bar 3 with the high E. And then you complete the exercise using as many suspensions as possible. So we can see there's a suspension in bars 1 into 2. There's a suspension in bars 4, 5, and then the penultimate bar and the semi-penultimate bar. But the other ones don't have suspensions, but they do have tied notes. And when they don't have tied notes or suspensions, it's just operating in second species. And then just want to remind you to write the intervals between the voices, and you're just writing the generic intervals, but I do recommend specifying the correct octave. So if it's an 11th, write 11 instead of 4. I don't actually know that I do that here. Let's see if I do. So I did write in the intervals. Remember, I'm still putting perfect intervals in boxes because we have to just be careful about perfect fifths. In fourth species, you really don't have to worry about this at all. I know it's almost not a big deal, but we're still doing it. All the other species, you do have to be careful about parallel perfect fifths and octaves and unisons. So an octave there, B against A is a 7th. That is dissonance that needs to resolve down by step as long as it's prepared, and it resolves down to a 6th for B to G sharp. Then in the next bar, you have a 6th, you have a 10th there, so C sharp up to E. Then the cantus firmus jumps up to F sharp, and the upper voice is still holding the E, So that's a seventh. That seventh has to resolve down. It was prepared. It's going to resolve down. It resolves down to a sixth. Then we saw that we could have a chain of suspensions here because whatever suspension works in bar 4 should be able to work in bar 5, and it does. A 7 going to a 6. So there's an E in the cantus firmus against a D in the upper voice, and the D resolves down to C sharp. Okay, and now here, even though the C sharp is tied over, it's not a suspension because the cantus firmus has gone down to A, and it's A in the lower voice, C sharp in the upper voice, that's a 10th. So the counterpoint is free to move around wherever it wants on the next beat, so it goes down to a different chord tone, the A, which is an octave. And then here, notice we do have 2 boxes in a row, so we should just check to see that those are not parallel perfect intervals, but they're not because one's an octave, one's a fifth, so it's fine. The B in the B in the cantus firmus, F sharp in the counterpoint, so that's a fifth. The counterpoint's jumping up to D, which is the 10th, and then that 10th is tied over, but again, this is not a suspension, that's actually an octave, so it can go wherever it wants, and it jumps down to a 6th B. Now we set up the chain of suspensions that take us to the end of the piece. So that B is preparing the B here, the B in the upper voice there is a 7th against the C sharp in the cantus firmus, and the 7th has to resolve down to a 6th, which it does. That prepares the next note. B is in the cantus firmus, and A is in the counterpoint, and that resolves down to G sharp, which is the leading tone. And then we have a cadence. I think we get to hear it one more time. So I'm just pointing out here, you have a 7-6 suspension at the beginning, 7-6 there, 7-6 there, 7-6 there, and 7-6 there. There's other kinds of suspensions you can use, particularly the 4-3, but in this particular case, it's just 5 different instances of the 7-6 suspension. Okay, let's listen.
A, B, G sharp, C sharp, F sharp, E, C sharp, A, F sharp, D, C sharp, B, G sharp,
All right, so that is how you write or logically think through an exercise in 4th speeches counterpoint. Let's look at another example. This time we're putting the cantus firmus above. Oh, it says cantus firmus below. It's the counterpoint that's below. Cantus firmus is above. And this one is in minor, so it's a little bit different for that reason. I kept all the steps below the same, but I have a couple of boxes to point out. But first, let's give it a listen.
G, G, D, flat, A, G flat, C, D, B flat, G, F, A, B flat, G, A, F sharp, G.
So if we were doing this ourselves, we would do the same thing. We'd sing the cantus firmus a couple times. Enough times to just memorize it. Okay, and then we would look at the beginning, look at the end. The only difference here is that since the counterpoint is below the cantus firmus, we have to begin on scale degree 1. We can't begin on scale degree 5 because we need to establish the mode. And then the ending is going to be the same general idea. We're going to suspend and resolve into the leading tone. And resolve that. So for step 3, identify passages in the cantus firmus that descend by step. So we can scan the cantus firmus. So possibility there in bars 2 and 3. In bars 4 and 5, possibility of having the same kind of suspension. And again at the end, we can have a chain of suspensions. So let's just see what the composers did for this. Since we are doing the counterpoint is in the bass now, we don't have a 7-6 suspension. We don't have a 4-3 suspension. Instead, we have different types of suspensions. 7-6 inverts to a 2-3. It's like a seventh inverts to a second, a third inverts to a sixth. And then the 4-3 inverts to 5-6, and that's not really a suspension because both the fifth and the sixth are consonant, but it's the same sort of principle. Okay, and then, finally we sketch in a climax. And the climax here is the C in bar 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, and now let's look at the specific intervals used at the beginning. The interval is a unison, and then you have a fifth that's on the downbeat there, and then a third there. The C in the cantus firmus is against a B flat that's just below it. Just remember that C in the cantus firmus is middle C, right? So the B flat that's in the bass clef is right below it. So that's a second that resolves down to a third. Next you have a sixth and a third, E flat in the cantus firmus and C in the bass. The cantus firmus moves down to create a second, a D in the cantus firmus against a C in the lower voice that's holding on. That second has to resolve down to a third. Then the cantus firmus moves to a unison. Note that unison is okay here, even on a downbeat, because the lower voice is being held over. So you don't really lose the sense of the separate voices with unisons. Okay, resolving down to a third. We have a fifth here on the downbeat and another third. And then that third is sort of there to create the A that the third in the previous bar prepares the A, and then as the cantus firmus moves down to a B flat, that A below it is a dissonance that wants to resolve down to the G, to a third, and then the cantus firmus again moves down by step to an A that creates a second with the G below it, which has to resolve down to a third, to the leading tone, and then they both resolve to a unison. Let's give it a listen. Actually, let's pay attention first to the types of suspensions we have there. We have a 2-3 suspension. So remember, 2-3 is a bass suspension. The bass voice is the one that's suspended. Again, a 2-3 here, and a 2-3 here, and a 2-3 here. Let's listen one more time.
G, D, D flat, A, G flat, C, B flat, G, F, A, B flat, G, F sharp, G.
So, as we noted, the suspension is a dissonance. It's prepared by a consonant and resolves downward by step to a consonant. So, how do you know which voice is the suspended voice and therefore the one that must resolve? Interestingly, our good friend Giovanni Maria Artusi, who really lived at the same time as the composer that we were talking about earlier. So, Artusi referred to one voice as the agent and the other as the patient. And I really like this analogy. So the agent in fourth species would be the cantus firmus. And that's moving in whole notes on the downbeat of the bar. And nothing the counterpoint does affects what the cantus firmus does. But the cantus firmus does affect the counterpoint, right? So, I mean, that's kind of obvious because the cantus firmus is written first. But we use the cantus firmus, like in fourth species, we look ahead to where we want a suspension, and we put the counterpoint voice in a certain place so that when the cantus firmus moves to its next note in the following bar, it creates a dissonance that forces the counterpoint to move. So in that case, the cantus firmus really is the agent. The patient just means the one who's passive. The patient, it also means the one who suffers, suffers the actions of the agent. So the patient is the contrapuntal voice, which suffers the effects of the cantus firmus, and is forced to move because of the cantus firmus. The patient simply holds its previous note over, but when the cantus firmus agent moves to its new role, the counterpoint patient must resolve down to discharge the dissonance. Now, it's kind of like a fancy way of talking about all this stuff, but it corresponds to something in my mind about how I think about this too. And the fact that it's artusi, I thought you guys would appreciate that. So, the possible suspension patterns all follow a simple rule. A dissonance resolves by step to a consonance. The dissonances are to second, fourth, and a seventh, right? And then they're compounds. So instead of 2, you could have 9. Instead of 4, you could have 11. Instead of 7, you could have 14. A 14th. So in theory, in theory, any of these dissonances could resolve stepwise to their compounds. So in theory, a second could resolve inward to a unison or outward to a third. A fourth could resolve inward to a third or outward to a fifth. And a seventh could resolve inward to a sixth or outward to an octave. But that's in theory. In practice, not all of those sound as good. In practice, only some of these possibilities sound good in 2 voices. So these are the ones that you should actually learn are the good ones. Admissible suspension patterns are as follows. So when the cantus firmus is below, it's the example we looked at first, then the 4-3 suspension is acceptable. The 7-6 suspension is the most common and the best one to use. 4-3 suspensions, you actually see that in classical music all the time. But when we're talking about species counterpoint, the 7-6 is actually more common. And I have asterisks next to those because those are the ones that are best that you can use in series. You can use a 9-8 suspension, but it's less good, especially in 2 voices. And they write that you should only use a 9-8 suspension when it's justified by melodic requirements. So assume that for 2-voice counterpoint, you're not going to do 9-8 suspensions unless you really have to. 2-1 is the same thing as 9-8, but the difference is that it resolves to a unison. And they say this is the least good, it's best reserved for emergencies. Something that I find interesting is we looked at Guido of Arezzo from 1025. We looked at his counterpoint advice, and the way the cadences that he recommends always are a 2-1 convergence upon a unison. So that was definitely considered, the best type of suspension to use at that very early period when composers were first working out polyphonic practice. But by the time you get to the Renaissance, at least, the 2-1 in just 2 voices is not considered as good. Okay, when the cantus firmus is above and the counterpoint is below, then the 7-6 suspension, if you just take the same exact notes, it just inverts to a 2-3 suspension. And then that's the same exact thing as a 9-10 suspension. So that one is a great one to use, very common. The 4-5 suspension is possible, right? A fourth is a dissonance. You could resolve a fourth to a fifth. It's fine, but just don't use it in series because you would create a series of perfect fifths, basically. The 7-8 suspension is just one that's not common. You're not going to use it. Okay, and then just pointing out that the asterisks here mean that those can be used in series. So those without asterisks cannot be used in series because they would produce parallel fifths, octaves, or unisons. Okay, and let's just look at some options for the second half of the bar. The second half of the bar does not always have to prepare a new dissonant suspension. You could have both 5-6 motion or 6-5 motion, which just means, like one of the voices is holding a note, the other voice is moving, and it moves from a fifth to a sixth or a sixth to a fifth. And both of those intervals are consonant, so it isn't a suspension, but you're still allowed to do it. And it's not a dissonant passing tone, it could be a consonant passing tone, but you can use 5-6 motions and 6-5 motions. Okay, after a resolution on beat 1, the counterpoint may leap to another consonance. The counterpoint may pass through a dissonance on beat 2, a stepwise motion. So we could have a dissonant passing tone. 5/6 motions, these could appear in series. 6/5 motions, it shouldn't appear in series. That's considered less desirable, and that's because they kind of create an accented series of fifths, or an unaccented series of fifths on the second half of the bar, but they do say like you maybe could use it at some points. Okay, a series of suspensions of the same type should not occur more than 3 times in a row. And then the following are reasons that you might want to break species, i.e. to the reasons to resort to second species. You might curtail a suspension series of more than 3 statements of the same suspension type. So you don't want to have too many of the same type of suspension in a row. You might want to provide some melodic relief, because suspensions are always resolving downward. So if you just want to prevent your melody from just always resolving downward, you might want to break species. And then sometimes you might run into errors if you just follow the natural course of events. So you could prevent errors by breaking species. Let's look at the beginning of the exercise and the ending of the exercise. So at the beginning, as we mentioned, you're going to begin with a half rest. For the upper counterpoint, when the cantus firmus is in the lower voice, you're going to begin with either an octave or a fifth. So there I penciled them both in, but the authors chose the octave. And
A, G sharp, C.
Okay. And if the counterpoint is below the cantus firmus, you have to begin at either the unison or the octave below. You can't begin at the fifth. And we heard this too. We'll come back to that in a second.
G, D, B flat.
And we can see here that this looks just like a suspension. In the example on the left, it really is a suspension. In the example on the right, it's not a suspension, but it's still a note in the end of bar 1 that's tied over to the beginning of bar 2. And it just so happens that when it's tied over to the beginning of bar 2, the G in the bass against the D in the alto is a fifth. It's a consonant. So the bass is allowed to move freely. It doesn't have to resolve down by step. And now let's look at some principles of how to end things. The final measure is always going to be a whole note on the tonic. That's the same exact thing we've had with all of our species counterpoints so far. The penultimate measure, second to last measure, should always be 2 half notes. One is tied over from the previous bar. So you can see that resolving to an octave, suspending, and resolving into a previous bar.
E, C, D, B, C. E, C, D, B, C. G,
Just a quick brief couple of notes on dissonances and perfect intervals. So all the dissonant suspensions resolve downward. Right? You're not allowed to use retardations, which is like an upward resolving suspension. And then you do learn about that in the next chapter. And note that you might have a dissonant passing tone on the second half of the bar, which could resolve either upward or downward. But a suspension is always going to resolve downward, and suspension is on the first half of the bar. A passing tone would be on the second half of the bar. So I mentioned you don't really have to worry all that much about parallel perfect intervals, parallel fifths, parallel octaves, parallel unisons. So as we know, if you remember from second species, you had to pay attention to whether you have parallels from beat 1 of one bar to beat 1 of the next bar, or from beat 2 of one bar to beat 1 of the next bar. But you don't have to worry about them from beat 2 of one bar to beat 2 of the next bar. So that's the same thing that we have here. If you have parallels on beat 2 of one bar and beat 2 of the next bar, it's fine. It doesn't matter, as long as there was a consonance on the downbeat of the previous bar. The one thing you don't want to do is resolve a suspension into a fifth in one bar and then do exactly the same thing. Resolve a suspension again into a fifth, because that will create the sense of parallel fifths. Unisons, I mentioned, they're okay in the second half of the bar. They're frequent, especially when the counterpoint is below and the cantus firmus is above. as a preparation for the 3-2 suspension. We actually did see an example so unisons are always okay at the very end, in the very beginning. We saw an example where there is a unison, I thought, in the first half of the bar, but maybe I'm wrong about that. You can go back and watch the video and see if you're curious. So, in some sense, this can be quite simple. It can be simple. Sometimes a fourth species line is really just a first species line shifted to the right, i.e. syncopated. So let's see an example. So that's plain old first species. Now all we're going to do is we're going to take the notes in the upper voice, shift them over. Okay, so exactly the same notes, just shifted. Now, if you look at the intervals, on the left you have 8, 10, 8, 6. On the right you have 8, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. So you still have 8, 10, 8, 6, but you have a new interval on the downbeat of the bars. And that new interval, in that case, is an 11th. 11th is a fourth, right? Compound fourth, and that's a dissonance, so it has to resolve down. It does. The 9th is a compound. Second is a dissonance, it has to resolve down. And the 7th is a dissonance, it has to resolve down, and it does. So fourth species can be as simple as just taking a first species line and shifting it over. Let's look at 2 incorrect types of suspension. So in this example, it's the same that we had in the last one, except we just kind of shifted it the opposite way. And this one is just, it does not work. So why does it not work? The dissonance has to be on the strong beat. You can see here the 7 in bar 2 is on the second half of the bar. So that doesn't work. If it's on the second half of the bar, it would have to be a passing tone, and it's not. Same in the third bar, the 9th. That's on the weak beat instead of the strong beat. So this is all wrong. These are actually just anticipations, and you'll learn about that in the next unit. But this is not correct suspensions. Let's try this one. So here the dissonants are the 9th, the 7th, the 9th in bars 2, 3, and 4. They're on the downbeat, but what's wrong? The dissonances are resolving up rather than down. So these guys are actually retardations, not suspensions, and you're going to learn about those in the next unit. Let's look at the individual suspension types. So start at the top, the 4 suspension types when the counterpoint is above the cantus firmus. So 7-6 suspension, that's our common one. This is also great, 4-3. And this one they say we're not going to use the 2-1 because the convergence on the octave in the second half of the bar. So let's move on. This is what's going on when the cantus firmus is above and the B is below. This one you don't want to do. It's fine when you have more voices, but in 2 voices it's too exposed. And that's 2-3 or 9-8. It's the same exact thing. You could treat them in the same way, just octave difference. Okay, And then finally, I know this is very small, but we don't need to look at this. This is all the stuff we talked about in this presentation, but I just wanted to put them in one place if you want to take a little screenshot. And then, whoa, hey there, there's the count. Shoot, we can't see the rules anymore. Maybe we could get the count to move. Oh, thanks, count. Hey, what about, it's still hard to see. What if the students need to see the, okay. Thanks a lot. Guys, I'm sorry. But yeah, just rewind and take a screenshot if you want it, or ask me and I'll send you it as a PDF.